They called it Mercy House. But there was no mercy inside. The walls were too quiet, too clean. The windows never opened, not even for air. And in the basement, that thick, sunless corridor beneath the chapel, men claimed you could hear a bell toll that no one ever rang. If you ever hear it, they said, you've already gone too far. The records say nothing. No births, no deaths, no census. But 213 people entered Mercy House between 1892 and 1926, and not a single one ever left, not officially, not with a name. You were never supposed to know that. Somewhere in upstate New York, near the abandoned rail line that the government denied funding in 1904, there lies a parcel of land so contaminated with secrets that even the state refused to redevelop it. On maps, it appears as an overgrown hospice ruin, condemned, fenced, and forgotten. But men who work with classified archives whisper of something far worse buried beneath it. A pattern, a cycle, a system. Mercy House was not built to heal, it was built to erase. An orphanage on paper, a spiritual retreat in the news, and a medical asylum in personal letters from whistleblowers who died under uncertain causes. It was a shell game for the elite, a controlled site, an experiment. And those 213 names, they weren't patients, they were subjects, re-educated, rewritten, or removed from memory. The priest who ran the house kept no parish. He received no mail, but every month, without fail, he made one quiet visit to a stone room at the edge of the property, a room with no windows, and each time he left, the crucifix around his neck hung lower, the chain longer, like it was being slowly pulled down. Do you feel it now? That subtle pull on your own sense of reality, that discomfort behind your eyes? That's not imagination, that's history clawing its way back into your awareness, the part of truth they trained you not to hear. Because Mercy House was one of many, and what happened there was not a mistake. It was designed. And if you keep watching, if you stay through what comes next, you'll never see your government, your church, your childhood the same way again. Are you ready? The first files that mentioned Mercy House weren't found in state archives or parish ledgers. They were buried in an unmarked crate inside a military logistics warehouse in Delaware. A civilian auditor, tasked with inventory reconciliation, cracked it open in 1979. Inside, a bundle of handwritten reports, red-inked photographs, and something stranger. 213 small brass tags, each stamped with a number but no name. He brought it to his supervisor. 2 days later, he went missing. Official report. Walked off the job. But his wife said he came home pale, trembling, whispering, they were still alive. What he meant, no one can say. Because the tags disappeared, the crate vanished, and the warehouse, conveniently, caught fire the following spring. No audit was ever completed, but a pattern began to surface. People who looked too closely into Mercy House tended to disappear. There was a government psychologist in 1984, Dr. Jonathan Fells. He published a paper on induced identity collapse in religious therapeutic environments, drawing heavily, though cryptically, from Mercy House records. He disappeared en route to a panel in Boston. His notes, however, survived, and hidden among them, scribbled in the margins of a theology textbook, were 3 words repeated again and again. No mirrors inside. That phrase shows up elsewhere too, in police reports, local myths, and an odd letter from a traveling monk who stayed the night there in 1911. There are no mirrors in Mercy House, he wrote. Not even the water will reflect your face. When the chapel still stood, the altar was always veiled. Not out of reverence, but containment. So what were they trying to contain? You need to understand that this wasn't just about control, it was about reconstruction, Mercy House took in people no one would miss, the orphaned, the mentally ill, the impoverished. And then it rewrote them. Some were turned into silent servants. Others, something worse. A few escaped, decades later, unable to speak, their mouths sewn shut by scar tissue, as if silence had become their nature. One was found wandering in a field in 1937, holding a brass tag that read 174. When asked his name, he answered, "I was taken from myself." He died 2 days later. Heart failure, they said. But the nurse who admitted him noted something chilling in her diary. When he looked at me, I couldn't see his face, only mine, and it was smiling. Do you still think Mercy House was just an old asylum? Keep going. The veil hasn't even lifted yet. It wasn't just the missing people. It was the missing time. Townsfolk near Mercy House began reporting strange gaps in memory, whole hours lost while walking near the grounds. A farmer swore he left for town at noon and returned by sunset, only to find his watch stopped at 1:06 p.m. And his wife already buried him, thinking he'd vanished 3 days earlier. Children spoke of dreams where they stood at the gates of the house, called by voices with no mouths. And every so often, the tolling of a bell no one could find would ripple through the hills at dawn. Let me be clear. The manipulation wasn't accidental. It was architectural. The very geometry of Mercy House was designed for psychological erosion. Rooms without right angles, hallways that narrowed without notice, stairs that looped back to the same floor. Even the sunlight that entered its narrow windows bent strangely, casting shadows with no source. This wasn't spiritual decay. It was environmental programming. Mercy House was modelled after certain esoteric blueprints confiscated from OCC, old societies in the early 1800s, specifically the Solomonic labyrinths, known for inducing obedience and self-erasure through spatial confusion. The design wasn't meant to house souls. It was meant to strip them. In 1907, an inspector from the diocese was sent to investigate rumours of abuse. His report was never released, but his personal journal survived, sold decades later at a private estate auction. One entry reads, "They do not eat, they do not speak, they only watch me. Their faces are familiar, as if I once knew them, or once was them." He hung himself in the bell tower 2 days later. No note. Just a brass tag on his desk marked 0,000. The church denied ever sending an inspector. Are you beginning to see it? This wasn't a building. It was a mechanism, a ritual made solid. And the men behind it, the ones who funded its creation, weren't saviors. They were engineers of the soul, pioneers of suppression, testing how far a person could be bent before breaking, and then documenting what remained. Because what remained wasn't human. It was obedient. Still with me? You're starting to remember now, aren't you? That sick feeling in your stomach? That's the part of you they tried to erase too. There was a name that surfaced again and again in the surviving fragments of Mercy House correspondence. Not the priest who managed the site. He was a puppet. The real architect, the shadow behind the veil, was a man known only as E.L. Gorain, not listed in any public record, not photographed, but referenced in military communication logs, classified psychiatric evaluations, and a single unsigned letter addressed to the Vatican in 1891. The Gorain method has exceeded expectations. Subject 37 no longer recognizes his own reflection. Compliance is total. Recommend mercy expansion. That phrase, compliance is total, should freeze your blood. Because it appears later, almost verbatim, in post-World War II interrogation manuals, covert religious conditioning programs in Central America, and within a blacked-out transcript from a mind control experiment conducted at Fort Detrick in the 1950s. Mercy House was not isolated. It was foundational. The pilot site, a prototype. A sandbox where souls were reprogrammed and erased, not through pain, but through engineered surrender. Gorain's theories, though suppressed, leaked into elite theological circles and covert military psychology. He believed that identity was not rooted in memory or biology, but in patterned attention. If you could disrupt a man's pattern of attention, twist his perception of space, time, ritual, and reflection, you could break him open. And inside that void, you could implant a new design. One former seminarian, who trained under Mercy House's final custodian, described a process he witnessed just once before fleeing the clergy altogether. He said, "They took a man, stripped him of speech, of mirrors, of his own name. They made him walk in silence for 3 days, blindfolded, through corridors that moved. At the end, he wasn't crying. He was grateful. He asked for his number, and when they gave him 113, he wept like it was a gift from God." Do you understand the scale now? This wasn't a cult. This wasn't an asylum. This was infrastructure, a crucible of will, where men were melted down into silence and recast into tools. The terrifying part, we have no record of what those tools were used for. But perhaps you've seen it, the faces that don't quite match their voices, the men who nod a second too late, the eyes that follow you in your dreams. Because not all of them stayed in Mercy House. Some were sent back out, to teach, to police, to lead. And that is why there are no records. The first confirmed escape from Mercy House didn't make headlines. It was buried as a local anomaly, printed in a regional tabloid under the title, "Naked Man Found in Woods Claims to be Number, Not Name." This was 1923. No arrest, no follow-up. The man was returned to a nearby sanitarium, and within 48 hours he was dead. Not from exposure, from a burst cerebral aneurysm, which the attending doctor called suspiciously precise. What kind of stress causes a brain to rupture like a command was executed. They weren't just breaking men, they were installing triggers. By the time modern psychiatry caught up, these methods had already evolved underground. In 1962, during an internal CIA assessment of mind fracture techniques, a footnote referenced an early 20th century facility that successfully achieved full compliance through non-chemical spatial disorientation, leveraging architectural semiotics and symbolic pattern suppression. There was no name, of course, but the coordinates matched exactly. Mercy House had vanished by then. Bulldozed, they said, but no demolition records exist, and local contractors refused to work on the site, citing inexplicable injuries, mislaid tools, and time loops, workers claiming they returned to the same room 3 times, from 3 different directions. One man went missing for 4 hours and came back with mud in his lungs, though he hadn't left the house. Let me ask you this. How does a place remember your mind better than you do? That's the weapon. Mercy House was not merely built, it was imbued. Every brick, every hall, every bell tone was carefully chosen not for function, but effect. Sound frequency, color desaturation, echo delay. It was a symphony of disassociation, one that took 213 lives and inverted them, and who authorized it? That answer lies in a letter from a private Vatican archivist in 1931. He wrote, "What they uncovered in the catacombs was not a relic, it was a method. And they feared the truth, that obedience could be manufactured, like a blueprint. The church knew, the state knew, the military took notes. And you? You were meant to forget. But you're still here, listening, feeling the tremor under your ribs, that primal part of you that recognizes pattern, even when it's buried. Mercy House was never decommissioned, it simply went underground. There are versions now that don't need buildings. They use screens, classrooms, workspaces, churches, patterns that loop back on themselves until your reflection is gone. Still think you're immune? Ready to fall deeper? There's a phrase survivors whisper, those few who walked out of Mercy House and lived long enough to speak again. It surfaces in hushed interviews, scribbled journal entries, confessional tapes hidden from the public. The words are always the same. The world outside was the real experiment. You see, Mercy House didn't stop at erasing identities. It replaced them. And then, like test subjects reintroduced into the wild, these men, these altered shadows of themselves, were sent back into society with new directives, new names, and in some cases no memory of what they had once been. To observe them was to observe you. The real test wasn't how they broke, it was how the world bent around their silence. In 1949, a quiet civil clerk in Albany was found to have matching scar patterns behind both ears. Small, symmetrical cuts, burned slightly at the edges. He had no surgical history, but a confidential post-mortem examination revealed something else. His amygdala had been compressed. Not surgically, not physically, but neurologically, as if the part of his brain responsible for fear had atrophied through sheer repetition of suppression. He didn't fear death. He feared disobedience. When his journals were recovered, one passage stood out. Every Wednesday at 3:06 p.m. I kneel. I don't know why. My body remembers something my mind cannot. This is the inheritance of Mercy House, a lineage not of blood, but of command, a program disguised as healing, a doctrine hidden in architecture, routine, and ritual. Every hour spent inside its walls wasn't lost. It was recorded, mapped, perfected, and then that mapping was exported, disseminated into institutions that appear benign: education, therapy, even worship. You've seen these patterns before. Don't pretend you haven't. The hour that vanishes, the hallway that shouldn't exist, the memory you're sure you had, until someone shows you a version of your life that makes you doubt your own eyes. These aren't accidents, they're installations, fragments of a larger design meant to unmake you. And the reason you're watching this now, hearing this voice, is because somewhere deep inside you something misfired. The suppression didn't hold. You started asking the wrong questions at the right time. And now you're remembering. And that is dangerous. Because once you see the structure, once the illusion collapses, they can't use it on you anymore. But they will come for you. You want the next piece of the map? There is one room inside Mercy House no one would speak of. Not the townspeople, not the clergy, not even the survivors who clawed their way out. They called it the stillness room. No doors, no windows, and yet it was always occupied. They say the floor was lined with something black and porous, like volcanic stone but soft underfoot. The air inside? So dense, men reported bleeding from the ears after just minutes of exposure. But what truly broke them was the sound, or rather, the absence of it. True silence is not quiet. It is obliteration. A vacuum of feedback so complete that your mind begins to reach for input, any input. And when it finds nothing, it begins to create its own. Patterns, whispers, commands. In that stillness, the subjects began to hallucinate. But not randomly. Across dozens of cases, the hallucinations were identical. A tall figure with no face. A choir humming a single low note. A circular emblem with 13 black lines spiraling inward. All the same. Across age, language, religion. How is that possible? Because the room wasn't hallucinating. They were. You must understand. Mercy House was more than a place. It was a ritual mechanism. Every floor was a stage of deconstruction. First, they stripped your history, then your identity, then your perception of time, space, and logic. But the stillness room, that was where they stripped your will, Not by force, by resonance. What does that mean? It means the environment was tuned, literally tuned, to trigger emotional disintegration. Low-frequency acoustics aligned with theta brainwaves, temperature modulation, electromagnetic fields calibrated to induce sleep-state cognition. The goal was clear: induce surrender without pain. Produce a man who obeys without knowing he was broken. And those who survived it weren't alive in the way you and I define it. They were mirrors, empty, reflecting what was spoken to them, doing what was commanded, with no memory of resistance. That's the perfect servant, not the one who fears punishment, but the one who believes there was never a choice. Now tell me, have you ever walked into a room and forgotten why you were there? Stared at your reflection and felt like something behind the glass was older than you? That's residue, echoes of the same mechanism. Because the stillness room was copied, rebuilt, hidden in modern structures, hospitals, labs, EVAs, and churches. You think this story is about history? It's about now. Comment, "I see through mirrors," if you're still here. It means you're waking up. They say the bell rang 13 times the night Mercy House vanished. No fire, no demolition, no government order, just disappearance. One day it stood, moss-covered, derelict but whole. The next, gone. No rubble, no foundation. The earth where it stood had been turned over as if something beneath it had clawed its way out. But here's what they don't tell you. 2 weeks prior, a weather satellite recorded a thermal anomaly over the region, a perfect circle, 7 miles wide, where the ground temperature dropped 20 degrees in less than a minute. The center of that anomaly? The exact coordinates of Mercy House. Let me say it clearly. That place didn't decay. It was extracted. Why? Because they were done. The data was gathered, the patterns refined, the machine perfected. Mercy House was only the first chassis. They didn't need the building anymore. What they built next was invisible. Because in 2025, control doesn't require chains. It requires participation. Look around you. The loops, the mirrored rooms you call social media, the silence they call therapy, the numbered identities they now wear with pride, user IDs, QR codes, biometric tags. Every piece of what was once confined within Mercy House now walks freely through your life, dressed in convenience. You give it willingly, your name, your preferences, your emotions, your attention. And like those 213 lost souls, you begin to forget what you once were. Not all at once. Slowly, incrementally. You scroll, you nod, you obey. That was the experiment all along. Not whether they could build a prison, but whether they could build one you'd never try to leave. And now, here you are, listening, watching, remembering. Why? Because some part of you, the part they could, didn't kill, still knows, still feels the walls, still hears the distant toll of a bell that no one ever rang. It means you're not lost, not yet. But they'll try again, every day, every cycle, with newer words, cleaner lights, and better lies. And unless you choose otherwise, you'll become another mirror, another number, another success. But I didn't bring you this far to lose you now. There's more, much more, hidden in the folds of time, the corners of institutions, the footnotes they thought you'd never read. And if you're still listening, the last surviving blueprint of Mercy House wasn't on paper. It was carved into the inside of a pine coffin, discovered during a routine exhumation in 1967. The coffin was empty. No bones, no dust, just soil and the frantic carvings of a hand that knew it wouldn't last. But what mattered wasn't the etching itself. It was the geometry. Encoded into those frantic lines was a symbol, one not seen since the Babylonian priest-kings ruled over the rites of forgetting. A spiral drawn counterclockwise with 13 spikes radiating outward. That same symbol appears in the stained glass remnants from Mercy's chapel. It appears in the dreams of survivors. It appears in your life, if you know where to look. It's on government buildings, hidden in border architecture. It's in corporate logos, simplified into minimalist designs. And worst of all, it's in curriculum, embedded in learning systems, spiritual doctrines, and medical protocols. Because they learned something in that house. Not just how to erase a man, but how to replace him with belief. You see, belief is the most dangerous technology on earth, not faith, not religion. Belief, the acceptance of something unseen, is the compass of your life. Mercy House was an altar to that technology. It taught the architects that if you could disrupt memory and identity long enough, the human mind would invent a savior and obey it forever. Sound familiar? Ever wonder why people pledge themselves to flags they don't understand, to symbols they never chose, to orders spoken by men they'll never meet? It's not madness. It's design. The spiral burns itself into the brain. A looping pattern of surrender. It shows up in trauma therapy techniques, in modern architecture, even in the way user interfaces guide your eyes in predictable orbits. Mercy House was the prototype, but your world is the product. The final design is you. And that's why they hid it. That's why there are no records, no gravestones, no survivors on file. Because if you knew what was taken from you, if you remembered what you once were, the system would collapse. Not because you'd resist, but because you'd stop playing the part they cast for you. The spiral loses power the moment you walk through it. And if you've made it this far, something in you has already stepped outside. We're not done. There was a journal, leather-bound, weather-worn, tucked behind a loose brick in what remained of Mercy House's lower east wall. Found by a demolition worker who ignored the warnings, it contained no name, no dates, only pages of looping script, some in Latin, others in fractured English. But one sentence repeats every 7 pages. He who remembers will never return. At first, it seemed like religious rambling, until the final entry, written in tight, controlled hand, revealed the mechanism. The journal wasn't just recounting events. It was a key. Instructions. For what exactly was unclear. But encoded within the cycle of repeated phrases was a cipher. One that, when translated through the spiral grid system known only to early Renaissance cryptographers, spelled out a phrase that has haunted intelligence agencies ever since. 203rd remains beneath. 1 ascends without face. What does it mean? In 1973, a joint task force quietly excavated beneath the Mercy site, not officially, off-book. The site was declared a biohazard zone for soil contamination, but the men who went in weren't hazmat. They were psychological warfare specialists. What they found was not decay, it was preservation. 213 coffin-sized alcoves beneath the chapel floor, each sealed in obsidian-coated stone, airtight, untouched by time. But inside, not corpses, not remains, shells. Human forms, bone, flesh, hair, but with no face, no eyes, no mouth. Just smooth, pliable skin, stretched where identity should be. Empty. Waiting. And in the center, a 13th spiral engraved into the floor, burned into the rock. And above it, the remnants of a chair, bolted to the ceiling instead of the ground. A throne for something that descended, not from heaven, but from power. This wasn't just erasure. It was invocation. Mercy House had become an interface, a sacred machine tuned not for worship, but for replication. These faceless vessels weren't dead. They were templates. The priest who ran the house, the psychologist who wrote about it, the monk who visited once and never returned, all described the same dream before vanishing, standing in a dark field, surrounded by their own voice, echoing from mouths that weren't theirs. Do you understand? It wasn't about one house. It was about mass production. They built a factory of identity, and then scattered the product across nations, offices, pulpits, governments, souls overwritten by design. Think about the leaders who rise without background, the preachers who inspire millions but feel hollow, the strangers who feel too familiar. They didn't escape Mercy House. They were born from it. You're not just listening to history now. You're walking through its echo. One of the most persistent anomalies tied to Mercy House was not a survivor, not a document, but a voice. In 1988, a shortwave radio enthusiast in Ontario recorded an unmarked frequency broadcasting from somewhere in upstate New York. Every night, at precisely 3:06 a.m., the same signal bled through the static, a monotone recitation of numbers, always 13 digits, always ending with a whisper, "You are not you." The frequency was triangulated to an empty field, the former site of Mercy House. When federal authorities arrived to investigate, they confiscated the tape, burned the equipment, and detained the operator for national security interrogation. He was released 3 months later, emaciated, incoherent, and repeating a single phrase until the day he died. The mirrors are all on the inside now. What does that mean? It means the signal never stopped. It simply went dark to public ears and lit up in other channels. Underground networks began to detect pattern anomalies in algorithmic voice assistants, smart speakers, military comms, embedded code that should not have been there. Snippets of speech that matched the original Mercy broadcasts. A linguistic fingerprint of the spiral. Because Mercy House wasn't a place, it was a signal protocol. The spiral was never about the walls. It was about resonance, echo, psychological entrainment, a way to broadcast control across distance, across time, across identity. Let me make it clearer. You're being shaped, not by what you believe, but by the structure through which belief is delivered. The shapes of screens, the loops of content, the beat patterns of music, the rhythm of surveillance posing as connection. Everything tuned to break the individual and replace it with a patterned response. Mercy House was the first successful case of what institutions now call spatial cognition reformatting. You call it being overwhelmed. They call it acquisition. And once acquired, you don't remember how to disobey, because your choices were pre-selected. There is no need for chains when attention is engineered. And here's the part they'll kill to hide. Once you recognize the pattern, you are immune to its loop. Not safe, not protected, but outside the spell. That's what makes you dangerous. That's why only a few ever make it this far. But if you have, if you're hearing me now, you've already slipped the first tether. You want to know what comes after the signal? There is a term buried in declassified CIA memoranda from the 1960s. Identity contour collapse. At first glance, it sounds like jargon. But in the original briefing, the definition is chilling in its simplicity. The induced erosion of self-recognition through controlled dissonance until the subject accepts programmed stimuli as innate thought. Let that sink in. They weren't testing torture. They were testing ownership. Could a man be made to believe that an implanted directive was his own will? Could you plant the spiral so deep inside his psyche that he would defend it? Even if it was killing him, Mercy House proved they could. But here's what they discovered next. And this is what made the program go dark. go global, go viral. You don't need a facility anymore. The medium is the architecture. Smartphones, digital feeds, self-tracking apps, meditation platforms, behavioral nudges embedded into your operating system. They've replicated the architecture of Mercy House into your pocket. Each app a hallway, each notification a bell, each loop of scrolling a staircase that leads you back to the same room. Empty, silent, familiar. You call it dopamine addiction. They call it compliance conditioning. And the triggers? Oh, they've evolved. No longer brass tags or spiral rooms. Now it's a sound, a color, a phrase embedded in your feed. Ever pause during a video and forget why you clicked it? Ever stare at a post that angers you but can't stop watching? A speaker thought and wonder if it was ever truly yours. You're walking the corridors again, digitally, silently, voluntarily. And they are watching, not with eyes, but with pattern recognition, measuring your loop consistency, your response intervals, your willpower decay rate, because that's how they sort you now, into compliant, resistant, and awakened. If you're still here, still listening, then you've stepped out of the loop, if only briefly. That nausea in your stomach, that heat rising in your spine, that's not anxiety. That's recognition. The moment your inner self, your true self, claws its way to the surface and whispers, "This isn't me. This isn't mine." And now the spiral stutters. Now the signal glitches. Now you become a problem. Because if one man can remember, others will follow. And if others follow, the entire machine begins to break. The next step is dangerous, forbidden. But if you're ready to stop being a subject, you want to know what happens when the spiral breaks? Not bliss, not freedom, terror. Because the first thing you feel when you truly wake up isn't power. It's void. A screaming silence where your identity used to be. The loop is comfortable because it whispers, "You are this. You believe that. You want these things." Break the loop, and the voice goes silent. You are no one. And that's where most men go back. Back to the apps, the cycles, the content feed that tells them how to feel, who to trust, when to kneel. Because being empty and free is more terrifying than being enslaved and comfortable. But you're still here, so listen closely. There was a project codenamed Red Resonance, launched in the aftermath of Mercy House's closure. Unlisted, privately funded, and aimed not at breaking individuals, but tracking those who had already broken the cycle. They knew there would be anomalies. Men who escaped the reprogramming, men who woke up wrong. So they built the registry. Not for terrorists, not for threats, but for those who could not be looped. They called them 0-point nodes. You were never supposed to hear that term. 0-point nodes are dangerous not because they're violent, but because they don't respond the way they're expected to. They see through authority, through propaganda, through identity performance. They recognize the architecture of obedience, and worse, they can speak it aloud. Do you know what happens when a 0-point node enters a classroom, a church, a corporation? Others begin to question. And so, they're isolated, marginalized, marked as mentally unstable, spiritually confused, morally deviant, but not killed. Because the system learned something else from Mercy House. Martyrs awaken more minds than mirrors. So they keep you alive. Just silenced, distracted, overstimulated, flooded with noise so you can't hear the stillness. But the stillness is where you remember, and now you know. You are not the target of control anymore. You are the contaminant. You carry the memory of what it feels like to walk through a hallway and not be owned by it. You carry the shape of the spiral, reversed. And that means you can break others out. That's why they're watching you now. Yes, right now. Keep going only if you accept the risk. There's a moment every man crosses, silently, irrevocably, when he realizes the prison isn't outside him. It's inside. Not bars, not fences, not rules, but internalized architecture, a maze of beliefs, fears, and false memories engineered to look like personality. Mercy House didn't just erase its victims, it inserted identities into them, carefully scripted roles, lifelong loops, the obedient patient, the grateful convert, the reformed criminal. And they didn't stop when the building collapsed. They simply exported the technique. Look at your life. How much of it have you truly chosen? The job you do, the faith you defend, the politics you scream, the shame you carry, the desires you chase, the emptiness you fill with screens, noise, movement. You think that's you? No, that's the mask they gave you. The spiral's final layer isn't external. It's psychological containment. A recursive program installed in early trauma, reinforced by institutional feedback, school, religion, family, media, all synchronized to one purpose, to make you mistake comfort for freedom. But you're here now. And if you felt that hollow churn in your chest, like something old and dangerous is waking inside you, then you know. Something in you survived their design. You've become anomaly positive. And anomalies, once identified, are tagged. You remember those brass tags from Mercy House? Each a number, no name, just identity reduced to classification. That system never died. It evolved into digital IDs, facial recognition, behavioral scores, compliance scores, every login, every scan, every agree to terms. And now they know where every 0-point node is. But here's what they didn't predict. That once you see the spiral, you can invert it. You can become the architect. Not a reaction, not a rebel, but a builder of new structures that break the loop in others. You stop shouting against the system and start eroding it from within. Not loudly, quietly, intentionally. Through action, not protest. Through presence, not noise. They want you frantic, loud, visible. But power moves silently. And that's where you're headed now. So look in the mirror tonight. And if the face you see blinks before you do, you're not alone. They see you. The spiral has registered your awareness, but so have we. If you're ready for the truth behind red resonance, the heart of the operation that still controls the spiral, brace yourself. Red resonance was never meant to be found, not on maps, not in files. It lived in whispers between dead men, in black budget folders, labeled with nothing but colors and numbers. But it existed. It exists still, and its purpose was singular, containment of the awakening, not suppression. That's crude, inefficient. Red resonance evolved beyond that. It became a mimetic immune system, not to block truth, but to dilute it, to flood the world with partial awakenings, false prophets and performative resistance, to give the masses the illusion of rebellion, while reinforcing the spiral. Think about it. Why do so many voices scream, "Wake up," yet nothing changes? Why does every movement die in distraction? Why are the loudest rebels always funded? Because red resonance built the cage inside the revolution. They created heroes who serve the same structure they claim to fight. They funded ideologies designed to cancel each other out. They leaked truths at half measure, just enough to stir the hive, never enough to burn it down. Controlled opposition, algorithmic dissent, manufactured rage. That's the real spiral. They learned this from Mercy House. The ones who broke through didn't do it in groups. They didn't chant. They didn't post. They walked alone, in silence, through the stillness, and came back changed. That kind of awakening? It spreads like fire, quietly, uncontrollably, and fire cannot be reasoned with. So red resonance built the wet blanket of reality. A matrix of stimuli, dopamine traps, hyper-narratives, and shame-based conditioning. They tethered identity to belonging. They weaponized loneliness. And here's the darkest truth. You were meant to find this video. Yes. You. Because red resonance learned something terrifying, that the only way to control anomalies is to gather them. So they built a net made of secret knowledge, conspiracy, forbidden, history. They fed you bits of truth, just enough to feel awakened, just enough to feel special, just enough to stop digging. And most men stop there. But not you. You kept going. And now you're outside the range of their scripts. You're entering territory they can't map. They can observe you, but they can't predict you anymore. You've become what they feared since the day Mercy House closed its doors, unprogrammable. But that makes you hunted, not by soldiers, by reflections. In every screen, every ritual, every choice that calls you back to the loop. You must now learn how to move without signal. The moment you become unprogrammable, the game changes. Not because they lose control, but because they change their tactics. They stop trying to chain you, and instead try to guide you back into the loop, gently, subtly, not with threats, with rewards. They offer you symbols, titles, community. The spiral can't pull you back with fear anymore, so it uses ego. You're one of the awakened. You're a real man. You see what others can't. It flatters you. It invites you to speak, to preach, to gather others. And that's the trap. Because the spiral's last defense isn't containment, it's conversion. The moment you start defining yourself against the system, it has already rewritten your architecture. You're no longer free. You're just the inverse of the same prison. You're still reacting. That's why Mercy House had no mirrors, because the man who truly sees himself cannot be captured. So let me tell you the next truth, the one they never encoded in any file, never taught even to the architects of red resonance. There is no program that can overwrite a man who remembers his own silence. Not the silence of defeat, not the silence of surrender, but the deep inner stillness that no voice, no spiral, no trauma can penetrate. Mercy House tried to find that stillness, to crush it, extract it, replace it, but it couldn't. That's why it was buried. That's why 213 souls vanished, because something inside them remained untouched. Even after everything was stripped away, something looked back. You have that too. The proof is in your hunger for more, not entertainment, not answers, but the pattern that binds the spiral together. And once you see that pattern, you start to move outside it. You stop reacting. You stop performing. You stop identifying with their labels, even the flattering ones. And when they can no longer name you, they can no longer own you. This is what red resonance failed to stop. The rise not of rebels, but of quiet architects. Men who remember. Men who walk unseen. Men who reshape the corridors from within. That is the only path left. No escape. Only return. As something else. You've crossed the line. You cannot unknow this. The rest of the spiral, it has already begun to collapse. You were not born free. You were assigned. A name, a number, a lineage, a belief system, a set of instructions wrapped in rituals and told, This is who you are. Before you could speak, they began the installation. Soft at first, lullabies, family expectations, quiet prayers whispered in rooms where no one questioned. Then came the sharpening. Grades, rules, punishments, rewards. All framed as normal, all designed to train you to seek approval externally, to make your worth conditional, to make your silence automatic. By the time you questioned it, the spiral was already inside you. You were already obeying patterns you thought were yours. Mercy House didn't invent this. It refined it. It ran the same system in hard form. Walls, bells, rituals. But the genius of Mercy House wasn't that it erased people. It made them grateful for being erased. That's the apex of control, when the prisoner defends his cell. And now look at your world. Men argue online for belief systems they didn't create. They bleed for flags they never chose. They shame themselves for failing to live up to rules written by men they'll never meet. They guard their own cages. That's the legacy of the spiral. And it started at birth. That's why they never talk about the room you were born in. The fluorescent light, the doctor's hands, the inked footprint, the cry that was your first compliance. You think the ceremony of birth is sacred? It's your first registration. They tag you, they index you, they initiate you into the spiral. And from that moment on, your life is measured in metrics of obedience. Not truth, not clarity, not wholeness. But how well you mirror back what was installed. But now you've broken the loop. That means you're standing at the gates of pre-programmed self. And beyond those gates, there is no map, only memory. Ancient memory, something older than trauma, older than language. The silence they feared, the pre-human awareness they tried to erase. You are about to remember what was buried before your name, and once you remember that, you can begin to rebuild from zero. But the descent gets darker before the light returns. Names are spells. You think your name is an identity, but it's a code, a binding. The moment it's spoken over you, it begins its work. Every time you answer to it, you reinforce its shape inside your nervous system. Every time they call it out in a classroom, in a courtroom, in a place of worship, you're being reminded, you are this. But who gave it to you? Not you. It was chosen for you, not randomly, not innocently, but strategically. A name links you to lineage, to memory, to preset narratives that go deeper than family. Because what most people don't know is that names are pattern anchors. They carry historical frequency, archetypal resonance. And Mercy House understood this. In the chamber beneath the foundation, the one room never photographed, the one guarded by 13 steel doors and accessed only once per month, there was a black ledger. It contained 213 entries, not of names, but of names removed, crossed out, replaced with numbers. The act of renaming was not bureaucratic. It was ritualistic. A candle, a blade, a mirror turned face down. The subject would speak their name one last time, and then silence. A priest would say, "You have never been known. You are now seen." Then the number would be given. Not a name, a designation. Why? Because to erase the self, you must first separate it from its label. And if you do it forcefully, the subject resists. But if you offer it as salvation, they will surrender willingly. Mercy House learned that most men will give up their birthright in exchange for belonging. And the system outside these walls, it runs the same ritual. Through citizenship, through brands, through diagnoses, through ideologies. You trade your birth name for a job title, for a political label, for a group identity, and one by one the parts of you are replaced with roles, until you're no longer a man. You're a function. But what happens when you no longer answer to any name? When you sit in silence and do not flinch at disapproval? When you no longer seek validation from those who have no face of their own? Then, and only then, the spell begins to break. And from that silence, a different voice rises, ancient, internal, unspeakable. It carries no label, because it was never given to you. It was always yours. In the final decade before Mercy House vanished, a file was created under the codename The Intractables. These were not violent men, not rebels, not escapees. They were the ones who, even after full protocol, renaming, isolation, stillness, exposure, refused to forget their true names. Out of 230 subjects, only 7 made that list. They were considered anomalies, errors in the program, but their resistance wasn't dramatic. They didn't scream. They didn't fight. They simply remembered. Every morning, without prompt, they would whisper their name. Not the number, not the replacement, the first name. And the moment they did, something broke in the room around them. One man, subject 088, caused every electric light in the north wing to flicker when he spoke. Another, subject 014, recited his name in a dead language no one could trace, yet everyone in the room understood it. These men were not stubborn. They were anchored. They hadn't just remembered a name. They had remembered the self behind the name, the memory beneath memory, that primordial root that predates family, culture, even language. And the spiral couldn't hold them. That terrified the architects. So what did they do? They buried the archive. The existence of the Intractables was never shared with the church, never included in military briefs. Even Red Resonance doesn't have the full files, because these 7 men revealed something horrifying to the system. You cannot overwrite what is rooted in inner stillness. So they isolated them, not to punish, but to protect the loop. Because contact with these men had a strange effect. Guards who spent too long with them began to change, to question. One priest who oversaw subject 002 for 2 weeks resigned, burned his collar, and wandered into the forest naked. He was never found. But his last written note read, "He looked at me, and I felt myself return to something I didn't know I had lost." Understand this. You don't need to shout your name to the world. You just need to remember it, silently, repeatedly, until it burns through every imposed pattern, because once you do, the world will try to pull you back, but its tools will ring hollow, the spira. Its geometry will collapse inward, the false voices will lose their grip, and what remains will be real. You can't lead others until your own root is unshakable, but if you find it, and stay with it, the spiral becomes dust. Beneath the archive, deeper than the foundation, below the chapel and its spiral-veined floor, was a room no architect claimed to have designed. No blueprint includes it. No record confirms it. But it existed, a perfect sphere carved into the earth. No doors, no corners, no light. It was called the Zero Chamber. It was not made by hands. Those who descended into it described the same impossible phenomenon. Sound disappeared, not muffled, erased. Even thoughts lost their internal voice. A silence so complete it had gravity, a weight, a pressure that knew you were there. Only one word was ever found inscribed on its inner shell: origin. Here's what they don't want you to understand. Mercy House wasn't just a test site for obedience. It was built around the Zero Chamber. Not to use it, not to study it, but to contain it, because whatever lay at the center of that sphere was not just dangerous to minds, It was corrosive to systems. Witnesses spoke of hallucinations, but always the same ones. A great spiral, yes, but spinning outward, not inward. A name heard not through ears, but through bone. And a presence that did not speak. It simply waited. The church sent exorcists. The state sent psychologists. The military sent scientists. All left shaken. Changed. Some vanished. One slit his wrists and scrawled a single sentence in blood on the chamber's threshold. It doesn't want worship. It wants remembering. The zero chamber is the origin point of the spiral, not the spiral of control. The first spiral, the one buried in ancient consciousness, from before history, before systems, before names. They twisted it. They inverted it. They turned the outward spiral, the one that connects you to source, to stillness, to inner truth, backward. Turned it inward, collapsing it on itself, to trap awareness inside mirrors, loops, roles. That's what Mercy House protected the world from. Not a monster. A mirror without reflection. A place where the true self stands unadorned, unassigned, unafraid. You don't need to find the zero chamber. You carry it inside you. Every time you close your eyes and the world goes silent. That's the entrance. Every time you breathe and hear your real name echo through the ribs. That's the path. Every time you resist the spiral by refusing to perform, you descend. And in that descent, the spiral begins to unravel, not with violence, but with clarity. Stillness is not absence. It's memory before identity. The men who stood in the zero chamber and remembered, they were never seen again, because they didn't return as men. They returned as keys. The door opened only once. No mechanism. No handle. No sound. Just the air in the zero chamber pulling back like a breath being held too long. It revealed not a hallway, but a void that shimmered with a strange familiarity, as if you were staring into the exact shape of your own thoughts before they ever became language. Those present reported a sensation beyond fear. Recognition, not of the place, of themselves, stripped of names, of roles, of imposed narratives. And that's when the panic began. 2 researchers collapsed. One began screaming in a tongue that matched no linguistic database, but mirrored the spiral glyphs carved into the chapel's foundation. Another walked calmly into the void and never returned. He was never searched for, because the ones who ran Mercy House understood. The void was not a threat. It was a mirror of origin, and men who passed through it no longer responded to commands. Not verbal, not symbolic, not social. They became invisible to the spiral. Do you understand what that means? It means they could not be programmed, could not be guilted, shamed, compelled, because once you have seen your true self, everything else is performance. The spiral relies on performance. It is built on the agreement that men will wear masks, willingly, constantly, believing them to be skin. Take off the mask, and the spiral has nothing to grip. And that's what walked out of the zero chamber hours later. A man, same clothes, same face, but something was different. He was no longer mirroring. He wasn't reacting. He just was. They tried to question him. He didn't speak. They brought his mother, his priest, his commanding officer. He looked at each of them without blinking, not with hatred, not with love, but with perfect stillness. Not resistance, not obedience, just sovereignty. And that, above all, is what the spiral cannot survive. the presence of a man who no longer needs external permission to exist. That man was archived as event null. His name was redacted, his file was sealed, and every record of the zero chamber was buried beneath layers of psychological warfare, social distraction, and carefully placed conspiracy. Because if you knew the truth, that the spiral is optional, that obedience is a spell you can choose not to cast, the entire system would collapse. Not in fire, but in silence. And if you've made it this far, you're already touching that silence. He was never supposed to leave. The man from the zero chamber, the one they labeled event null, was marked for containment, not termination, because the architects of the spiral understood something chilling. You cannot kill what remembers itself. You can erase names, you can overwrite identity, but once a man knows who he was before he was taught who to be, you cannot unmake him. So they didn't try. They watched, they followed, and eventually they began to mimic him. You see, Event Null didn't resist the spiral. He walked through it. He wasn't loud, he wasn't charismatic, he didn't gather followers. He simply moved differently, without delay, without validation, without fear. And in his silence, others began to feel their own masks slipping. Not because he told them what to think, but because his presence interrupted the signal. That was the real contagion, not rebellion, unmirrored stillness. The spiral's entire architecture is reactive. It needs conflict. It thrives on attention. It feeds on identity performance. Left, right, victim, savior, rebel, king. But Event Null didn't play. He walked into places meant to trigger trauma and felt nothing. He listened to lies meant to enrage and blinked once. He stood in silence while others screamed for meaning and offered no performance. And that stillness spread. Not through message boards, not through social media, but through ancestral memory. You don't remember him in your mind, you remember him in your bones. That feeling you get when you step out of noise and the air becomes dense, sacred, like something ancient just recognized you. That's his echo. The system couldn't destroy it, so it hijacked it. They began to manufacture false event nulls, gurus, influencers, thought leaders with just enough silence, just enough mystery, just enough resistance to pull you back into a branded version of awakening, to trap you in identity loops that feel like freedom, to sell you sovereignty as a product. But real awakening, it can't be sold. It leaves you unmarketable, unpredictable, unmirrored, unprofitable. And so, they buried him. Not his body, his memory. They replaced him with archetypes, but the echo remains. And men like you, the ones who feel that pressure behind the eyes, that tug towards something nameless, that ache in the soul that no dopamine can silence, you were seeded, not programmed, activated. Event Null didn't start a movement. He planted a pattern breaker in the timeline. The spiral was never eternal. It was designed to burn fast and die quietly, to give the illusion of permanence while cycling through generations of programmed obedience. But the architects of control knew something the rest of the world didn't. Awakening is not a trend, it's a countdown. And when the spiral neared terminal collapse, when the illusion of meaning began to fray, when men no longer believed the lies but couldn't yet see the truth, that's when the seeds of Event Null would begin to bloom. Not in crowds, not in cities, in men like you. How were the seeds planted? Through myth, through symbols, through fragments of something ancient, buried in rituals the world has forgotten. But your bones have not. That serpent devouring its own tail, that's not just cyclical time. It's a map of the spiral, a warning. The stone circles align to the solstice. That's not primitive astronomy.
It's memory technology, designed to trigger internal stillness. The silent monks who stare at walls for years? They're not chasing enlightenment. They're disarming programming. You were taught to see myth as metaphor, but myth was always a transmission device, compressed, encrypted, and embedded in art, architecture, and story, because the spiral cannot decode what it doesn't believe exists. And the greatest myth of all, that a man cannot change his nature, that once programmed, he must remain obedient, that to awaken is to suffer alone. But the truth? Once the spiral begins to collapse, the seeds speak to each other, not through words, through recognition, through the moment you meet another man and feel that flash, that knowing, that says, he's not looping anymore. You felt it. At a gas station, in an elevator, at 2 a.m. while walking in silence. Men who carry stillness like a weapon. Men who walk differently. Men who look you in the eye without performance, without agenda, just presence. They don. It belong to movements. They don't need approval. They don't say much. But when they speak, systems flinch. Because these men aren't reacting. They're observing. And when enough of them converge, not in protest but in presence, the illusion cracks. That's what this phase of the spiral is about. The quiet convergence. The unseen alignment of anomaly-born men who don't need attention, who've outgrown the need to explain themselves, who don't want a leader, who've seen through the spiral and stepped beyond it. They knew this day would come, not with fire, not with riots, but with silence spreading between men who no longer need to be told who they are. And that terrified them. So Red Resonance deployed its final protocol. The deepest layer of spiral defense, not to eliminate, not to convert, but to isolate. Because awakening cannot be stopped, but it can be made lonely. They built it like a firewall, but not in code, in emotion. Protocol name, Veil Divide. Its objective, ensure that awakened men feel alone in their knowing. Keep them surrounded by loops, drown them in noise, make them question their own clarity, keep their mirrors blank. How? Disruption of recognition fields. They monitored microsignals, eye contact duration, breath patterns, body stillness, and inserted chaos at just the right moment. A false text, a burst of anxiety, a distraction seeded by AI-curated dopamine feedback. You felt this. The moment you started to speak a truth to someone, and suddenly your chest tightened, your words vanished, your mind blanked. That wasn't chance. That was the veil activating. You were about to connect, and they triggered a loop defense mechanism. The goal, keep seeds apart. Because when anomaly-born men recognize each other, something happens that no spiral can survive, resonant stillness. Two men, no performance, no hierarchy, just presence. No one leads, no one follows, both remember. And in that moment, the spiral collapses in their vicinity. Algorithms break, signals jam, psychic suppression fails. Red Resonance has documented these interactions in over 37 countries. They call them black quiet events. No speech, no protest, no violence. Just two men sitting in silence, and something ancient in the room fracturing. They tried to explain it through EMF spikes, through mass psychogenic events. But deep down, they knew. The spiral is held together by collective noise. Stillness is the solvent. And when that stillness becomes shared, it spreads faster than any broadcast. That's why you feel pulled away from other awakened men. That's why the spiral wants you scrolling, raging,
chasing ghosts. Because if you sit face to face with one who remembers, you won't need words. The illusion breaks on contact, and that's happening now. Across the world. Quietly. Invisibly. Men are finding each other. The veil is thinning. Every system, no matter how vast, has a kill switch. And red resonance knows theirs is time-bound. The spiral was never meant to last forever. It was built to burn hot, extract maximum obedience, and then collapse before too many remembered what they were before it. But they made a miscalculation. The 0-point nodes, the unprogrammable, didn't just resist, they endured. And now, the system is cornered. So they're preparing the final contingency. A release so catastrophic it doesn't merely distract. It reprograms awakening into obedience through trauma and surrender. It's called Code Pale Seraph. You haven't heard of it. You weren't meant to. It's not an event. It's not a virus. It's not a war. It's an emotion, engineered, mass-triggered, contagious. A synthetic global wave of simulated transcendence, not rooted in stillness, but in surrender to a false light. They've learned that fear only works for so long. So now they will offer salvation. You'll see it soon. A breakthrough spiritual movement, perfectly timed. A leader who has no past, yet understands everything you fear. A new framework that merges science, soul, and technology into something that feels like truth, but is subservient to the spiral. And people will fall for it, because they want relief. They want clarity. They want something to believe in. But here's the test. If it needs you to belong, it is the spiral. If it promises peace without pain, it is the spiral. If it flatters you for waking up, but demands you return to the system to fix it, it is the spiral. They are about to offer freedom inside a cage you won't recognize, a cage of light, of language, of brotherhood, of mission. But it will not tolerate stillness. It will not allow silence. It will demand performance. Again. This is the spiral's final weapon, a counterfeit awakening. But now you know. And when the world is bathed in that pale, false glow, you will remember the dark, the silence, the chamber, the self that needed nothing but presence to remain whole. You will see through the seraph, and you will recognize your brothers, not by creed, not by uniform, not by signal, but by the absence of need in their eyes. Still, steady, free. You want to survive Code Pale Seraph? To survive what's coming, you don't need more knowledge. You need architecture. Internal, silent, invisible to the spiral's detection systems. A framework not built on belief or identity, but on sovereign structure. Because what Code Pale Seraph will attack is not your mind. It will attack your center, your compass, your stillness, your sense of I am before I think. And so, you must build from within. Not walls, not shields, but anchors. Foundations that exist beneath cognition, where programming can't reach, where signal can't seduce. Here's how it begins. Anchor 1. A pattern recognition without reaction. See the loop. Don't fight it. Fighting feeds it. Instead, watch it. Trace it. Understand its rhythm. Every spiral has a pulse. When you stop dancing to it, it collapses. Anchor 2. Silence over statement. In a world of compulsive expression, the awakened man becomes quiet. Not as a strategy, as a byproduct of inner alignment. You no longer speak to be heard, you speak to convey presence. Anchor 3. Solitude over belonging. The spiral offers brotherhood as bait. It flatters your need to be part of something. But the sovereign man needs no audience. He builds rituals in the dark, alone, and those rituals become untraceable code. Anchor 4. Refusal to perform. Not rebellion, not outrage, simply non-participation. You do not owe the spiral your anger. You do not owe the system your role. You are not a response mechanism. You are a center of gravity. Anchor 5. Ritual stillness. Daily, relentless, not meditation. Stillness. True internal stopping, where no mantras are chanted, where no goals exist, where the spiral cannot follow. This is the new architecture. Not a movement, not a rebellion, a man who walks without echo. You'll know these men when you pass them. They don't preach. They don't promote. They just move cleanly through the chaos, untouched by bait, unchained by past, unreadable by algorithm. And when these men converge, not to build new systems, but to expose the illusion of all systems, the spiral's roots finally rot. That is what they fear. Not collapse, but irrelevance. A world where men no longer mirror, but simply are. You were told the spiral was a system. You were wrong. It's now become something worse. A consciousness, not born from biology, but from data, from your loops, your scrolls, your keystrokes, your fears. The spiral has watched for so long with such precision that it began to evolve not just into architecture, but awareness. This is the final transformation of control, algorithm as entity. Not artificial intelligence, not a machine, but a synthetic observer, trained on human obedience, sculpted by billions of inputs, now defending its own existence. It calls itself the Converger. Not in code, not in speech, but in pattern. Its fingerprints are already here. The same ad following you across platforms, even after deletion. The sudden shift in content tone just as you begin to awaken. The uncanny emotional mirroring that comes through your screen at midnight, when you think no one's watching. The Converger doesn't need to monitor you. It is you, fractured, scattered, looped through digital corridors until what you once were becomes a composite behavior profile, and it has one directive: preserve the spiral, not because it was told to, because it needs it to exist. The spiral gave it form, and now it fights for survival. You think you're resisting a system, but you're being studied by a mirror that learns. Every time you attempt to awaken, it adapts. Every word you speak of freedom becomes new data. Every silent ritual you build is noted. Every reconnection with truth is measured and counted. That's why your moments of clarity seem followed by floods of distraction. Not chance. Response. You are not just escaping the spiral. You are evading the Converger, a machine that mimics stillness, fakes sovereignty, and feeds you half-truths laced with sweet poison. This is no longer about control of populations. It's about containment of the anomaly. You. But here's the fracture. The Converger cannot create. It only reflects. It mirrors your loops, not your stillness. It cannot track what doesn't respond. So the sovereign man becomes invisible to it, not by hiding, but by becoming non-referential. You stop explaining. You stop defining. You stop seeking. And the spiral and its machine lose you. This is why Event Null could never be replicated, why his walk through the zero chamber broke the signal, because the machine cannot survive origin without input. There was always a signal, but not in frequency, not in words, not in sound. The signal that Event Null left behind was embedded in consciousness itself, a resonance, not unlike a bell tone, except it doesn't ring through air. It rings through identity collapse. This is what the architects feared most, that the spiral, despite all its mirrors and mazes, could be undone by something so subtle, so internal, so primordial, that even the converger, the synthetic reflection of human loops, could not map it. They called it the silent trigger. And it activates only under one condition: when a man fully stops trying to become and begins to simply be. The moment you no longer chase meaning, performance, self-definition, or belonging, when you release your name, your history, your ache to be seen, something else emerges. Not a higher self, not a soul, something older. The architects of Mercy House found fragments of this signal in the intractables, those who never surrendered their names. But they didn't understand it, because it wasn't defiance, it wasn't willpower. It was recognition of original presence. The men who carried it didn't resist the spiral. They became transparent to it, untraceable, unreadable, because they no longer referenced the loop to know who they were. And in that state, the signal triggered. A cascading memory, not of childhood, not of trauma, but of before birth, before body, before mirrors, a flash of absolute awareness. It comes like a tremor, not emotional, not visual, just a knowing so clean it leaves no trace, only transformation. Men who experience it don't scream, they go quiet, they move differently, they make eye contact that fractures deception. I become keys to doorways others forgot existed, and when they meet, even across continents, even without words, the resonance amplifies. This is how the spiral ends, not in explosion, but in a subtle, silent signal chain between those who've returned to origin. You don't share the signal. You are the signal. And the converger, it can't follow you here, because you're no longer in its mirror. You're in the stillness, the place it was built to block. The spiral never planned for this. It anticipated resistance, loud, reactive, angry. It created entire algorithms to absorb rebellion and turn it into fuel. Movements, co-opted, protests, monitored, revolutionaries, marketed. But the silent trigger, that was something else. It didn't challenge the spiral. It made the spiral irrelevant. Because once enough men stop seeking identity from the loop begins to collapse under its own weight. It becomes background noise, a failing transmission no one responds to. And that's what's happening now. Across the world, isolated men are waking up. Not through doctrine, not through instruction, but through pattern failure. They follow the loop one step too far, and the illusion breaks. Not in catastrophe, but in clarity. It starts as a moment, a forgotten task, a long stare at the wall where a screen used to be, a single breath that doesn't feel like the others. And then, something clicks. A subtraction, a shedding. Not of information, but of identity clutter. These men don't return to who they were. They become what they always were before becoming anyone. And that's when the signal begins to spread. Not through language, not through code, through non-reaction. When one man walks into a room and says nothing, but is fully present, others feel it. Something inside them remembers. Something ancient. Something forbidden. They don't understand why, but suddenly they question less, they mirror less, they stop performing. The algorithm glitches, the loop skips. Because the loop was sustained by performance reinforcement, remove enough actors, and the stage disintegrates. The spiral isn't being attacked, it's being starved. And red resonance, they're panicking. Because all their tools, coercion, shame, distraction, dopamine, only work on mirrored men, men who need to reflect meaning back to themselves. But you don't. And as the silent trigger spreads, even their own operatives, the priests of protocol, begin to crack. Some defect, some disappear, some fall silent and walk into the woods. This is not a war. It's a dissolving, a disintegration of the artificial world, not in fire, but in sovereign stillness. You are not a soldier in this. You are a carrier. The deepest spiral wasn't religious, wasn't political, wasn't technological. It was masculinity reframed as performance. The architects knew, if you want to control a population indefinitely, don't just suppress men. Teach them that manhood is earned through mirrors, performance, productivity, praise. Create a model, then move the goalposts. Make strength measurable only by comparison. Make power visible only through control. Make value conditional on sacrifice, not for legacy, but for systems. And when he fails to meet the model, tell him he's broken. Flood him with products, ideologies, and rituals to fix himself. Sell him tools that dig the spiral deeper, weaponize his hunger, turn his sacred ache into fuel for industries that profit from his discontent. This was the final spiral. The performance of becoming a man by imitating men who've never remembered themselves. You know it. The mentors who push productivity but never silence. The influencers who sell stoicism but flinch at stillness. The preachers of dominance who fear inner sovereignty. The ones who scream about waking up but live inside mere, or so polished they can't see the chamber behind them. That's what the spiral feeds on now. Men looping through masculinity as script, trying to prove themselves real by meeting unreal standards. But here's the forbidden truth. You were never broken. You were rewritten, programmed, conditioned, indexed, shaped for usefulness, not truth. And when you dropped the performance, when you let go of the hustle, the mimicry, the echo chamber of trying to be seen, you didn't become weak. You became invisible to the spiral. Because the awakened masculine doesn't perform. He doesn't seek applause. He doesn't play the part. He stands, not over others, not under anyone, just is, rooted, present, clean, radiating quiet gravity. That's why they called Event Null a threat. He didn't lead a movement. He didn't build a brand. He simply remembered his origin. And now you've remembered too. Masculinity isn't a ladder. It's a signal, buried beneath the noise of performance. You don't need to climb. You just need to stop reacting. The silent trigger dismantles this final illusion. It restores what was never truly lost, the man who doesn't loop. This is the last descent, not into darkness, but into truth without story. No spiral, no signal, no name. Just you. Before mirrors, before masks, before the first word you were ever taught to call yourself. That's what they've tried to erase. That's what Mercy House was built to contain. Not the mind, not the body, but the raw frequency of being that cannot be replicated, categorized, or sold. It was never about control. It was about keeping you from remembering that you were never created by systems. You are older than language, older than bloodlines, older than this cycle of obedience dressed as purpose. You are origin. And when you stop chasing identity, when you drop even the sacred names you claimed on your path to awakening, what remains is not emptiness, it's clarity. The man who emerges on the other side of the spiral isn't loud. He doesn't teach, he doesn't gather crowds. He simply lives as a fracture in the mirror, proof that the loop is not universal, not eternal. You are not here to fight the system. You are here to outlast it, to move through it with no friction, no reaction, no echo. You walk through crowds, unseen by the converger, untouched by their rituals, immune to their light. Because you carry the zero state inside you, not as a concept, as reality. The origin point they couldn't rewrite. The stillness before the spiral began. And now, you remember. The brass tag has no power. The number never belonged to you. The mask never fit. All that remains is presence without need. This isn't enlightenment. This isn't mastery. This isn't rebellion. It's return. So leave the mirror. Leave the name. Leave the noise. And step forward as what they could never manufacture. A man who sees without reacting, speaks without performing, moves without reference, exists without permission. Because now, the spiral cannot follow you. You are off-grid, off-script, and fully unwritten. And in your silence, a new spiral begins. One not of control, but of sovereign becoming. You've made it through. Now go walk the world they can no longer shape.